Sometimes the most unexpected encounters happen when we least expect to find love. Every man has a moment when his carefully built walls come crashing down at the sight of someone who changes everything forever. In the wilderness of 1870s Colorado, mountain man Wes Calder lives alone, tracking elk through remote canyons. When he finds Iris Monroe tied to a tree by bounty hunters, he whispers words that will haunt them both. "I haven't hunted anything this beautiful." Instead of taking her to town, he brings her to his hidden cabin. She's running from a dangerous past, and he's never trusted anyone with his heart. But in the golden sunlight streaming through his windows, something sacred begins to bloom between them. Will their love survive when the bounty hunters return seeking revenge? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun painted gold across the pine needles as Wes Calder knelt beside the fresh elk tracks, his weathered fingers tracing the deep impressions in the damp earth. At 29, he had lived in these Colorado mountains for 7 years, long enough for his hands to grow calloused from splitting wood and his eyes to develop the keen focus of a man who survived by reading the subtle language of the wilderness. The silence here ran deeper than any church, broken only by the whisper of wind through towering pines and the distant call of a red-tailed hawk circling high above the canyon walls. His cabin sat hidden in a grove of aspens, 2 miles from the nearest trail that decent folks might travel. He had built it himself, log by careful log, chinked with mud and moss to keep out the mountain cold. 3 rooms was all a man needed, one for sleeping, one for cooking, and one for the work of staying alive. Hand-carved arrows filled a wooden quiver by the door, each one shaped with the patience that came from having nowhere else to be and nothing but time to get things right. Wes had learned early that survival meant attention to detail. The arrows had to be straight, the fletching perfect, the points sharp enough to punch through, hide, and into the heart beyond. He tested each one by candlelight, running his thumb along the shaft to feel for the slightest imperfection. A crooked arrow meant an empty belly, and an empty belly in winter meant joining the bones that bleached white in hidden valleys throughout these peaks. The tracks he followed now belonged to a bull elk, probably 8 points, moving steady through the timber toward the high meadows, where the grass still grew sweet, despite the advancing autumn. Wes had been tracking this particular animal for 3 days, learning its habits, its preferred routes, the places it stopped to rest and feed. Hunting wasn't about the kill any fool with a rifle could kill. Hunting was about understanding, about becoming part of the pattern that connected all living things in these mountains. He rose slowly, brushing dirt from his buckskin pants, and adjusted the leather strap of his bow across his shoulder. The weapon had belonged to his father, crafted from seasoned yew and wrapped with sinew at the grip. His father had taught him that a bow demanded more of a man than a riflet, required patience, skill, and the wisdom to get close enough to your quarry that you could see the life in its eyes before you took it away. "Respect what feeds you," his father had said during those long-ago lessons in the Tennessee hills. "Take only what you need and waste nothing." The old man had been gone 5 years now, buried beneath a simple wooden cross in a valley that probably didn't even have a name. Wes still carried those words with him, along with the bow and the arrowheads his father had napped from obsidian, traded with the ute bands that still moved through these high places. Following the elk trail deeper into the timber, Wes found himself thinking about the supplies he would need come winter. His last trip to Morrison had netted him salt, coffee, and a few other necessities, but he tried to keep those journeys to town as infrequent as possible. Towns meant people, and people meant questions he didn't care to answer. They looked at him with mixture of curiosity and wariness, this tall, lean man with sun-darkened skin and grey eyes that seemed to see too much. The women especially watched him with something he couldn't quite name. Not fear, exactly, but a recognition that he belonged to a different world than theirs, one where survival trumped comfort and silence held more value than conversation. Some had tried to draw him into their parlors, their church socials, their carefully ordered lives of routine and expectation, but Wes had learned long ago that he wasn't built for such things. The mountains had claimed him, and he had no desire to be claimed by anything else. The elk trail led him up a steep ridge where granite outcroppings broke through the thin soil like the backbone of some ancient beast. His breath came harder in the thin air, but his legs were strong from years of navigating these slopes. Below him, the valley spread out in shades of gold and green, aspens shimmering in the afternoon breeze like coins scattered across the forest floor. He paused at the ridge top, studying the terrain ahead. The tracks continued down into a narrow canyon where a stream chattered over smooth stones, the sound carrying clearly in the mountain air. This was good hunting country, the kind of place where an elk might stop to drink and rest, unaware that death followed its trail with infinite patience. Wes had just started down the far side of the ridge when he heard voices floating up from the canyon below. Human voices, rough and urgent, cutting through the natural quiet like a blade through silk. He froze, every sense suddenly alert, his hand moving instinctively to the knife at his belt. In 7 years of mountain living, he had encountered other people in the deep wilderness exactly 4 times. Twice, they had been lost travelers, grateful for directions back to known trails. Once they had been claim jumpers, men with shifty eyes and nervous hands who had ridden away quickly when they realized he wasn't the easy mark they had hoped to find. The 4th time had been a pair of Ute hunters who had shared his fire for one night and taught him 3 words in their language before disappearing into the dawn like smoke. These voices carried a different tone, entirely harsh, impatient, touched with an edge that made the hair on the back of his neck rise. Wes moved carefully down the slope, placing each foot with the silent precision that had kept him alive through countless hunts. The voices grew clearer as he approached, and what he heard made his jaw tighten with anger. "Stop your struggling, girl. Ain't gonna help you none. Boss said bring her back alive, but he didn't say we couldn't rough her up some if she keeps causing trouble. Pretty little thing, ain't she? Shame to waste all that on a rope." Wes crept to the edge of a boulder that overlooked the stream and peered down into the canyon. 3 men stood in a small clearing beside the water, their horses ground-tied nearby. 2 of them were holding a young woman whose hands had been bound behind her back with rope. Even from his elevated position, he could see that her dress, what remained of it, had once been expensive. The torn satin gleamed like water in the filtered sunlight, but it was dirty now, stained with mud and what looked like blood. The woman herself was perhaps 23, with auburn hair that caught fire in the sunbeams, slanting through the pine boughs above. Her face was streaked with dirt and tears, but her chin was raised in defiance, despite her obvious terror. She was beautiful, there was no denying that, but it was her spirit that caught Wes's attention, the way she held herself straight, despite being outnumbered and bound. The flash of anger in her green eyes, when one of the men reached out to touch her face. "I told you to keep your hands to yourself," she said, her voice clear and strong despite the tremor that ran beneath it. "When my family learns what you've done." "Your family ain't gonna learn nothing," the largest of the 3 men interrupted. He was perhaps 40, with a graying beard and the kind of thick build that spoke of too many saloon meals. "Your family thinks you're dead, girl. We aim to keep it that way until we collect what's owed." "The bounty says dead or alive," one of the others added. He was younger, maybe 25, with pale eyes and hands that kept fidgeting with the gun at his hip. "But alive pays better." "For now," the 3rd man said. He was thin and dark, with a face like a hatchet and scars that spoke of a violent life. "Boss might change his mind once he gets a good look at what we brought him." The woman Iris, they had called her, tried to pull away from their hands, but the rope around her wrists held tight. "You're making a mistake. I haven't done anything to deserve this." "That ain't for us to decide," the bearded man said. "We just bring 'em back. What happens after ain't our concern." Wes had heard enough. His hand moved to the quiver at his shoulder, fingers selecting an arrow by touch alone. The range was perhaps 60 yards, well within his capabilities, but there were 3 of them, and they were positioned around the woman. A miss could mean her death, and something about her defiance in the face of terror had awakened protective instincts he thought he had buried with his father. He knocked the arrow and drew the bowstring back to his cheek, feeling the familiar tension of yew and sinew. The largest man would be first that seemed to be the leader, and his death would likely demoralize the others. The shot was clear, the target unaware, the outcome certain. But as Wes held the draw, studying his target through the gap between pine branches, something made him pause. The woman had lifted her head, and for one impossible moment, their eyes met across the distance. She couldn't have seen him clearly. He was well hidden among the rocks and trees, but somehow she knew he was there. Her expression changed, hope flickering to life behind the fear. In that instant, Wes understood with crystalline clarity that this moment would change everything. He had lived 7 years in solitude, asking nothing from the world except to be left alone. But some things, once seen, could not be unseen. Some wrongs, once witnessed, demanded action, regardless of the cost. He released the arrow. The shaft flew true, taking the bearded man in the center of his chest. He dropped without a sound, his body crumpling beside the stream. The other two spun around, hands reaching for their weapons, but Wes was already knocking a second arrow. "I wouldn't," he called out, his voice carrying clearly across the canyon. "Your friend there had 3 inches of broadhead through his heart before he knew he was dying. You boys want to join him. Just keep reaching for those guns." The pale-eyed man's hand froze halfway to his pistol. "Who are you? What do you want?" "Name's Calder," Wes said, rising slowly from behind his boulder. "As for what I want, that's simple enough. You're going to untie the lady and ride out of here, right now." "Like hell we are," the dark-faced man snarled. "You know what she's worth? $500, dead or alive." "She's worth more than that," Wes said quietly, stepping down into the canyon with arrow nocked and ready. "But not the way you boys are thinking." The pale-eyed man looked at his dead companion, then at the arrow pointed at his chest, and made the smart choice. "Come on, Crenshaw. This ain't worth dying over." "The hell it ain't." Crenshaw's dark one reached for his gun. Wes's second arrow took him through the throat before the pistol cleared leather. The man fell backward into the stream, blood mixing with the clear mountain water. The remaining bounty hunter raised his hands slowly. All right, I'm riding out, but you don't know what you're getting into, mountain man. That girl there is wanted for murder. You're harboring a killer." "That's between her and God," Wes said. "You just worry about staying alive long enough to find the trail back to whatever rock you crawled out from under." The man backed toward his horse, moving carefully, keeping his hands visible. "Boss ain't gonna like this. He'll send more men." "He's welcome to try," Wes replied. "Mountains are full of places to bury folks who don't mind their own business." After the surviving bounty hunter had ridden away, Wes turned his attention to the woman. She stood perfectly still beside the stream, watching him with eyes that held equal measures of gratitude and wariness. Up close, she was even more beautiful than he had realized, but it was a beauty touched by sorrow and hardened by experience. "Are you all right?" he asked, pulling his knife to cut her bonds. "I think so," she said softly. "Thank you. I thought I was going to die." As the ropes fell away from her wrists, she rubbed the raw marks left by the hemp. Her hands were small and soft, the hands of someone who had never known hard labor, but there was strength in them too. "Those men called you Iris," Wes said. "That your name?" She nodded. "Iris Monroe. And you're Calder, you said?" "Wes Calder." He studied her face, noting the intelligence behind her green eyes, the way she held herself despite her ordeal. "They mentioned a bounty. You want to tell me what that's about?" She was quiet for so long he thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "It's complicated. Most things worth knowing are," he said, "but we can't stand here talking all day. That fellow who rode out might come back with friends, and these bodies are going to start drawing scavengers." He gestured toward his hidden cabin in the high country. "I've got a place where you can rest, get cleaned up, figure out what comes next. No obligations, no expectations. Just a safe place to catch your breath." Iris looked at him for a long moment, as if weighing her options. "Why would you help me? You don't even know me." "Don't need to know you didn't deserve what those men had planned," he said simply. "Sometimes that's enough." She smiled then, the first genuine smile he had seen from her, and it transformed her face completely. "I haven't hunted anything this beautiful," she said softly, repeating the words he had whispered when he first saw her tied to that tree. "That's what you said, isn't it?" Wes felt heat rise in his cheeks. "You heard that?" "I hear a lot of things," she said. "It's how I've stayed alive this long." He shouldered his bow and began gathering the arrows he could salvage. "Well then, Miss Monroe, I reckon you know enough to trust your instincts. What are they telling you now?" She looked at him, really looked at him, taking in his weathered features, his careful movements, the way he handled death without celebration, but also without regret. "They're telling me that maybe I've been running towards something instead of away from something all along." "Could be," he said. "Could be we both have." As they climbed out of the canyon together, leaving the dead men for the coyotes and ravens, Wes found himself wondering what twist of fate had brought this woman into his carefully ordered world. 7 years of solitude had taught him to value silence and simplicity, but something about Iris Monroe made him think that maybe, just maybe, there were some complications worth embracing. The sun was beginning to set behind the peaks as they reached his cabin, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Iris stopped in the doorway, taking in the simple but well-crafted interior, the stone fireplace, the handmade furniture, the quiver of arrows hanging beside the door like a promise of protection. "It's beautiful," she said, and he heard something in her voice that sounded almost like coming home. "It's quiet," he replied. "Sometimes that's the most beautiful thing of all." But as he watched her move through his space, touching things gently as if afraid they might disappear, Wes realized that the profound silence he had treasured for so long might not be what he needed anymore. Sometimes the most beautiful things came with their own kind of music, and he was beginning to think he had been listening to the wrong song all along. 3 days passed in the cabin like a held breath. Iris slept deeply the first night, exhaustion claiming her before she could protest Wes's offer of his own bed while he took the floor by the fire. When she woke the second morning, she found clean clothes laid out, a simple wool dress that had belonged to a woman from town who had traded it for venison the previous winter. It fit well enough, though it hung loose on her slender frame. She spent those first days quietly, watching Wes move through his routines with the fluid efficiency of a man who had learned to waste no motion. He checked his snares, split firewood, cleaned his weapons, and prepared meals with an economy of movement that spoke of years alone. When he spoke, it was in measured sentences, carefully chosen words that conveyed exactly what needed saying and nothing more. But Iris noticed things too, the way his eyes followed her when he thought she wasn't looking, the gentleness in his hands when he tended the rope burns on her wrists, the way he had positioned himself between her and the door without making it obvious. He was protecting her, but he was also giving her space to breathe, to heal, to decide what came next. On the 4th morning, Wes announced he needed supplies from Morrison. "Coffee's running low," he said, checking the contents of a tin container. "Salt too. Won't take but a day if I leave early." "I could come with you," Iris offered, though her voice carried uncertainty. "Might not be safe yet," he replied. "Those men could have friends in town, people watching for you. Better you stay here, where I know you're protected." She nodded, understanding the wisdom in his words, even as part of her chafed at the continued hiding. "How long do you think before it's safe to move around freely?" Wes was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the pine-covered slopes. "Hard to say. Depends on who wants you and how badly they want you." $500, she said softly. "That's what the man said." "That's a lot of money for most folks," Wes acknowledged. "Enough to make them persistent." He left before dawn, riding a sturdy bay gelding that he kept pastured in a hidden meadow 1/2 mile from the cabin. Iris watched from the window until horse and rider disappeared into the timber, then turned to face the profound quiet of the mountains alone. She spent the morning exploring the cabin more thoroughly, marveling at the craftsmanship in every joint and corner. The furniture was simple but expertly made, each piece fitted together with the kind of precision that spoke of both skill and patience. Books lined one wall, mostly practical volumes on hunting, wilderness survival, and basic medicine, but she also found a few novels and a worn volume of poetry that surprised her. It was when she opened the poetry book that the folded paper fell out, drifting to the floor like a dry leaf. She picked it up, intending to simply place it back between the pages, but her own face stared back at her from the yellowed newsprint. The wanted poster was professionally printed, complete with her photograph and a detailed description. Wanted for murder, the bold letters proclaimed. Iris Elizabeth Monroe, 500 reward, dead or alive. Her hands shook as she read the charges: the murder of Thomas Kellerman, a respected businessman from Denver. The date listed was 3 months ago, just 2 days after she had fled the city in the dead of night. Below her picture, in smaller print, was the name of the man offering the reward: contact Sheriff William Monroe, Denver County. Sheriff William Monroe, her uncle. The paper fluttered to the floor again as Iris sank into Wes's wooden chair, her mind reeling. He knew. Wes had known all along who she was, what she was accused of, how much money her capture would bring. He had seen this poster, probably in Morrison, and he had come back to the cabin anyway. He had chosen to protect her despite knowing the truth. Or had he? A cold thought crept into her mind like winter fog. What if his kindness was just an elaborate trap? What if he planned to turn her in himself, collect the reward after gaining her trust? $500 was more money than most men saw in several years. It would be enough to live comfortably for a long time. She paced the cabin's small confines, her mind churning with possibilities and fears. Every kindness he had shown her took on new meaning when viewed through the lens of suspicion. The careful way he watched her, the questions about her past, his insistence that she stay hidden, was it protection or imprisonment? Hours passed. The sun tracked across the sky outside the windows, but Iris barely noticed. She found herself studying the cabin's interior with new eyes, looking for signs of deception, for clues about Wes's true intentions. The weapons by the door, were they for protection or intimidation? The solid construction of the walls safety or a cage? When she heard hoofbeats approaching in the late afternoon, her heart began to race. She positioned herself near the back window, ready to run if necessary, though she had no idea where she could go in this vast wilderness. The mountains that had seemed like sanctuary now felt like walls closing in around her. Wes appeared in the cabin doorway carrying supplies in canvas bags, his expression immediately shifting to concern when he saw her face. "What's wrong?" She held up the wanted poster, her hand trembling slightly. "You knew." He set down the supplies carefully, his movements deliberate and calm. "Yes." "How long?" "Found it yesterday when I went to check my mail at the trading post," he said. "Figured you'd tell me when you were ready." $500, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's more money than you probably see in years up here." "It is." "So why?" The question burst out of her like a dam breaking. "Why didn't you turn me in? Why are you protecting someone you barely know, someone accused of murder?" Wes moved slowly to the fireplace, stirring the coals with an iron poker. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but firm. "Because I've seen enough of the world to know the difference between someone who's done evil and someone who's had evil done to them. You're not a killer, Iris. How can you be so sure?" He turned to face her, his grey eyes steady and certain. "Because killers don't cry in their sleep. They don't flinch when someone moves too fast, and they don't look at a man's weapons like they're expecting to be hurt. You're running from something, but it ain't justice." Tears she had been holding back for days finally spilled over. "They'll say I killed him for money. Thomas Kellerman was wealthy, and his will named me as a beneficiary. It looks like I murdered him for his inheritance." "But you didn't." "No." The word came out as a sob. "But I was there when he died, and I was the only witness to what really happened. The people who killed him, they're powerful, connected. They made sure the evidence pointed to me. Wes set down the poker and moved toward her, stopping just close enough that she could see the concern in his eyes. "Tell me what happened." The story poured out of her then, all the fear and grief and anger she had been carrying alone for months. Thomas Kellerman had been her father's business partner and her guardian since her parents' death 5 years earlier. He had discovered corruption in the city government, evidence of bribes and stolen funds that reached all the way to the sheriff's office. Her uncle William, the sheriff, had been taking money from criminal organizations in exchange for looking the other way. Thomas was going to expose it all, she said, wiping tears from her cheeks. He had documents, proof of the payments, records of crimes that had been ignored. He was going to take it to the territorial governor. But someone found out. She nodded. They came to his house that night. 3 men. They demanded the documents, and when Thomas refused to tell them where he had hidden them, She broke off, the memory still too raw to speak aloud. "They killed him," Wes finished gently. "I was hiding in the pantry. I saw everything, but I couldn't help him. I was too scared, too weak." The guilt in her voice was like a physical weight. "You stayed alive," Wes said firmly. "That wasn't weakness, that was wisdom. If you had tried to interfere, you'd be dead too, and the truth would have died with you." After they killed him, they searched the house for the documents. When they couldn't find them, one of the men said they needed someone to blame, someone the law would believe was guilty. They planted evidence, a bloody knife with my fingerprints, forged papers showing financial motive. By morning, I was wanted for murder. "And your uncle, the sheriff?" "He was one of the 3 men," she said quietly. "My own uncle, my only living family, watched them murder Thomas and then helped frame me for the crime." The admission hung in the air between them like smoke from a dying fire. Wes was quiet for a long time, processing the enormity of what she had told him. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a cold edge she had never heard before. "Where are the real documents? The proof of the corruption?" "Hidden," she said. "Thomas gave me a key before he died, told me where to find them if anything happened to him, but I can't go back for them. The moment I show my face in Denver, I'm a dead woman. Then we'll have to figure out another way." The word "we" hit her like a physical blow. "You believe me?" "I believe you," he said simply, "and I'm not going to let them get away with it." "But the reward?" "Money's just paper," he interrupted. "Justice is worth more than paper." She studied his face, searching for any sign of deception, any hint that this was all an elaborate performance. But his eyes held only truth and a growing anger at the injustice that had been done to her. "Why?" she asked again. "Why would you risk everything for someone you barely know?" He was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. When he did, his voice was soft but certain. "Because some things are worth the risk. Some people are worth fighting for. And maybe," he paused, as if weighing his words carefully, "maybe I've been alone in these mountains long enough to know what matters and what doesn't." The sun was setting behind the peaks, painting the cabin's interior in shades of gold and amber. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, the sound echoing off the canyon walls like a song of wildness and freedom. Iris felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of the fear and suspicion that had held her heart in a vice for so long. "I don't deserve this," she whispered. "Your kindness, your protection, I don't deserve any of it. Deserve's got nothing to do with it." "Wes," said, stepping closer, "sometimes the world gives us what we need instead of what we deserve, and sometimes that's the most beautiful gift of all." He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted to, and gently touched her face. His hand was warm and calloused from years of mountain work, but his touch was infinitely gentle. "I haven't hunted anything this beautiful," he said softly, repeating the words he had spoken when he first saw her. "But I'm not hunting you, Iris. I'm protecting you. There's a difference." She leaned into his touch, feeling safe for the first time in months. "What happens now?" "Now we figure out how to clear your name and make sure the people who killed Thomas Kellerman face justice," he said. "It won't be easy and it won't be safe, but we'll do it together." "Together," she repeated, tasting the word like wine. I haven't had together in a very long time. Neither have I, he admitted. Maybe we're both due. As darkness settled over the mountains and the fire crackled in the stone hearth, Iris felt something she had almost forgotten existed: hope. It was fragile as a bird's egg, precious as water in a desert, but it was real. For the first time since that terrible night in Denver, she believed that maybe, just maybe, there was a way through the darkness. And sitting across from her in the firelight, watching her with eyes that held promises of protection and something deeper, was the man who had made that hope possible. Wes Calder had saved her life, but more than that, he had given her a reason to fight for that life. The wanted poster lay forgotten on the floor between them, just paper and ink that could no longer define who she was or what she was worth. She was worth more than $500, more than the lies that had been told about her, more than the fear that had driven her into the wilderness. She was worth fighting for, and for the first time in her life, she had someone willing to do exactly that. The morning after their conversation about the wanted poster dawned clear and cold, with frost painting delicate patterns on the cabin windows. Iris woke to the sound of Wes moving quietly around the main room, building up the fire and preparing coffee. The familiar domestic sounds brought an unexpected comfort, a sense of belonging she hadn't felt since her parents' death. "Good morning," she said softly, emerging from the bedroom in the wool dress that was becoming as familiar as her own skin. "Morning," Wes replied, glancing up from the coffee pot with something that might have been relief in his eyes. "Sleep better?" "Much better," she admitted. "Thank you for everything." He nodded, understanding that she meant more than just the coffee and the warm cabin. The truth was out between them now, and with it had come a kind of peace that surprised them both. Over breakfast, Wes outlined his thoughts about teaching her basic survival skills. "If we're going to be partners in this fight," he said, "you need to know how to take care of yourself in the wilderness. Can't always count on me being there to protect you." "Partners," she repeated, liking the sound of the word. "I've never had a partner before." "Neither have I," he said. "Reckon we'll figure it out as we go." The lessons began that very day. Wes showed her how to read the weather in the color of the sky and the behavior of the birds, how to find water by following animal trails, how to identify edible plants and avoid the poisonous ones. His teaching method was patient and thorough, never making her feel foolish for her city-bred ignorance. "Everything in the mountains has a purpose," he explained as they walked through a grove of aspens, their golden leaves shimmering in the autumn breeze. "You just have to learn to see the connections." He taught her to move quietly through the forest, to place her feet where they wouldn't snap twigs or rustle dry leaves. "Prey animals live by listening," he said. "If you want to survive out here, you need to think like prey sometimes, always aware, always ready to disappear." The irony wasn't lost on either of them. She was prey, in a very real sense, hunted by men who wanted her dead or captured. But under Wes's guidance, she was learning to be dangerous prey, the kind that could bite back. It was during their third day of lessons that Iris found the leather-bound journal hidden in a hollow tree. She had been practicing moving silently, trying to approach a deer that was grazing in a small meadow, when her hand brushed against something soft, tucked into a gap in the bark. "Wes," she called softly, pulling out the small book. "Look at this." He approached carefully, studying the journal with curious eyes. The leather was worn but well-maintained, and when Iris opened it, they discovered pages filled with delicate sketches and pressed flowers. The drawings were exquisite detailed studies of mountain wildflowers, birds, landscapes, and abstract designs that seemed to capture the very essence of the wilderness. "These are beautiful," Wes said, his voice filled with genuine admiration. "Did you?" "Yes," Iris said quietly, surprised by her own admission. "I've been keeping a journal since I was a child. I thought I lost it when I fled Denver, but I must have grabbed it without thinking." She turned the pages slowly, revealing months of careful observation and artistic expression. Here was a sketch of a mountain sunset, there a detailed study of a hawk's feather. Between the drawings were pressed flowers, Indian paintbrush, mountain laurel, wild lupin each, one carefully labeled with notes about where and when she had found it. "You're an artist," Wes said, and there was wonder in his voice. "I was," she corrected. "Before everything fell apart, I painted and drew constantly. It was the only thing that made sense to me, the only way I could make sense of the world." "Why did you stop?" She was quiet for a moment, touching a sketch of roses that must have been drawn in her uncle's garden, back when she still believed he was family. "Hard to see beauty when you're running for your life. Hard to trust that anything good will last long enough to be worth capturing." Wes studied a particularly intricate drawing of a pine cone, noting the careful attention to detail, the way she had captured not just its appearance but somehow its essence. "Maybe it's time to start seeing again." "Maybe," she said, but her voice carried doubt. That evening, as they sat by the fire after a simple dinner of venison and wild greens, Wes brought up something that had been on his mind all day. "That journal of yours, it's not just drawings, is it? There are words too, pressed between some of the pages." Iris tensed slightly. "Some. Not much. Personal things?" "Very personal," she admitted. "Thoughts, fears, dreams I probably shouldn't have written down, evidence of how foolish and naive I was." "Can I ask you something?" Wes said carefully. "And you don't have to answer if you don't want to." She nodded, though wariness had crept into her eyes. "Before all this happened, before Thomas Kellerman's murder, were you happy?" The question caught her off guard. She had expected him to ask about the journal's contents, about secrets she might have recorded there. Instead, he was asking about something much more fundamental. "I thought I was," she said slowly. "I had a comfortable life, beautiful clothes, social obligations that seemed important at the time. I was engaged to be married to a man my uncle approved of, a banker's son, with good prospects and proper manners." "But were you happy?" She was quiet for a long time, staring into the fire as if the dancing flames might hold answers to questions she had never allowed herself to ask. "No," she finally whispered. "I wasn't happy. I was existing, going through the motions of what everyone expected me to be. The only time I felt truly alive was when I was drawing or painting, when I could escape into my art. And now I'm terrified most of the time," she said with a rueful laugh. "But underneath the fear there's something else, something I haven't felt in years." "What's that?" "Freedom," she said, surprising herself with the word. "For the first time in my life, I'm making my own choices. Even if they're dangerous choices, even if they might get me killed, they're mine." Wes nodded, understanding more than she realized. "Freedom's a hard thing to give up once you've tasted it. Is that why you came to the mountains? For freedom?" "Partly," he said. "Also, for peace. Been too much noise in my life, too many people telling me who I should be and what I should want. Up here, the only voice that matters is your own." "And what does your voice tell you?" He looked at her across the firelight, and she saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch. "Lately, it's been telling me that maybe 7 years of solitude is enough. Maybe some things are worth the risk of losing your peace." The air between them seemed charged with possibility, heavy with unspoken words and feelings that were growing stronger by the day. Iris felt her heart begin to race, not from fear this time, but from something much more dangerous, hope for a future she had never dared to imagine. "Wes," she began, but he held up a hand. "You don't have to say anything," he said gently. "I know this is complicated, with everything you're dealing with. I'm not asking for promises or declarations. I just want you to know that whatever happens, you're not alone anymore." She smiled then, the first truly radiant smile he had seen from her, and it transformed her entire face. "I think that's the most beautiful thing anyone has ever said to me." "Well," he said, his own smile answering hers, "you bring out the poet in me, I guess." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the fire burn down to coals. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called to its mate. The sounds of the wilderness had become as familiar to Iris as her own heartbeat, and she realized that this wild place was starting to feel like home in a way that no house in Denver ever had. "Will you show me more tomorrow?" she asked as they prepared for bed. About surviving out here, I mean. About reading the signs and understanding the mountain's language. Every day, he promised, until you know these peaks as well as I do. And will you let me draw you? The question slipped out before she could stop it, and she felt heat rise in her cheeks. I mean, for my journal. You're part of this story now, part of this place. I'd like to capture that, if you don't mind. Wes was quiet for a moment, clearly uncomfortable with the idea of being someone's subject. But then he nodded slowly. If it would make you happy. It would, she said softly. Very happy. As she settled into bed that night, Iris thought about the strange turns her life had taken. 3 months ago, she had been planning a wedding to a man she didn't love, trapped in a life that felt like a beautiful cage. Now she was hiding in the mountains, wanted for murder, dependent on a man she had known for less than a week. By all rights, she should be miserable. Instead, she was beginning to discover parts of herself she had never known existed. The woman who could learn to track animals and read weather signs, who could find beauty in pressed flowers and mountain sunsets, who could feel her heart race at the sight of a man's gentle smile. This woman was someone she was just starting to meet. And despite all the danger that surrounded them, despite the uncertain future that lay ahead, she found herself eager to see what tomorrow would bring. For the first time in her life, she was living instead of just existing, and that made all the risk worthwhile. In the main room, Wes banked the fire and checked the locks on the windows and door, habits born of years of careful living. But his mind wasn't entirely on security measures. Instead, he found himself thinking about the woman sleeping in his bed, about the way her eyes lit up when she talked about her art, about the quiet courage she showed in the face of impossible circumstances. He had told her the truth. 7 years of solitude had been enough. But he hadn't told her the whole truth, which was that he was already half in love with her, drawn not just to her beauty but to her spirit, her intelligence, her unexpected strength. She was like no woman he had ever known, and he was beginning to understand that she might be exactly the woman he had been waiting for without knowing it. Tomorrow he would teach her more about survival, about the skills she would need to stay alive in this harsh and beautiful place. But tonight, he allowed himself to hope that maybe, when all this was over, she would choose to stay not because she had to, but because she wanted to. The mountains had claimed him long ago, but perhaps they had room for one more soul seeking freedom and peace. Perhaps they had room for love. The silver locket had been her mother's, and her mother's before that, passed down through 3 generations of Monroe women, like a whispered promise of enduring love. Iris wore it always, hidden beneath her clothing, close to her heart, where its familiar weight provided comfort in the darkest moments. She hadn't told Wes about it, yet some secrets were too precious to share until trust had grown deep enough to hold them safely. It was their 7th morning together when the locket's chain finally broke. She was practicing with the bow Wes had made for her, trying to hit a target he had fashioned from pine bark attached to a dead tree. Her form was improving daily, though she still lacked the fluid strength that made his shots look effortless. As she drew back the string, the delicate silver chain snapped, sending the locket tumbling into the tall grass at her feet. "No!" she cried out, dropping the bow immediately and falling to her knees to search frantically through the autumn-brown vegetation. Wes was beside her in an instant, his hands joining hers in the search. "What is it? What did you lose?" "My mother's locket," she said, tears already starting to blur her vision. "It's all I have left of her, of my family. I can't lose it, I can't." "Easy," he said gently, his voice carrying the same calm tone he used with spooked horses. "We'll find it. Tell me what it looks like." "Silver, about the size of a dollar coin, with roses engraved on the front." Her voice trembled as she pushed aside grass and fallen leaves. "It has a photograph inside my mother and father on their wedding day." They searched in widening circles, moving methodically through the grass. The morning sun was climbing higher, making their task more difficult as shadows shifted and danced. Just when Iris was beginning to despair, Wes's sharp eyes caught a glint of metal near a fallen log. "Here," he said softly, holding up the locket. The chain was indeed broken, but the locket itself was undamaged. Iris took it with shaking hands, opening it to make sure the tiny photograph was still secure inside. The sepia-toned image showed a young couple, radiant with happiness, staring into a future they believed would be long and blessed. Her father's eyes were the same green as her own, while her mother's delicate features were reflected in Iris's face like an echo across time. "They look happy," Wes observed gently. "They were," Iris said, wiping tears from her cheeks, "until the fever took them both when I was 18. They died within 3 days of each other, couldn't bear to be apart, I think. That's when you went to live with your uncle." She nodded, closing the locket carefully and holding it against her heart. "He was my father's only brother, and I was his only living relative. It seemed natural at the time. I thought he loved me, that family meant something to him." "Maybe it did once," Wes said, though his voice carried doubt. "People change, sometimes for the worse. I used to believe that everyone had goodness in them, that family bonds were sacred." She looked down at the broken chain in her palm. "I was naive." "You were trusting," he corrected. "There's a difference." Wes examined the broken chain with careful fingers. "I can fix this. Won't look exactly the same, but it'll hold. You know how to repair jewelry." "Man learns a lot of things when he's on his own," he said with a small smile. "Had to fix my father's pocket watch on the same principle." That afternoon, while Iris worked on a new sketch in her journal, one of Wes's hands, as he cleaned his rifle, painstakingly repaired the delicate chain, using thin wire and small pliers from his toolkit. His large, calloused fingers moved with surprising delicacy, treating the fragile links as if they were made of spun glass. "There," he said finally, holding up the completed repair. "Should hold for another generation or two." When he fastened it around her neck, his fingers brushed against her skin, sending an unexpected shiver through her. She caught his hands before he could pull away, holding them against her collarbone, where her pulse beat quick and strong. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything. I don't know what I would have done." "You don't have to thank me," he said, but he didn't pull his hands away. "We take care of each other now. That's what partners do." The word partners had taken on new layers of meaning over the past week. They worked together seamlessly. Now she would spot game while he planned the approach, or she would tend the fire while he prepared their meals. There was an ease between them that surprised them both, as if they had been moving through these routines together for years rather than days. But underneath the domestic comfort, something deeper was growing. Iris found herself watching the way sunlight caught in Wes's dark hair, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the careful gentleness of his hands when he taught her new skills. And she caught him watching her too, and she laughed at something he said, when she bit her lip in concentration while drawing, when she emerged from sleep with her hair loose around her shoulders like autumn fire. That evening brought unwelcome news. Wes had ridden down to check his mail at the trading post, a weekly ritual that connected him to the outside world. When he returned, his face was grim. "What is it?" Iris asked, reading trouble in his expression. "Letter from Jake Morrison owns the trading post," Wes said, dismounting slowly. "Says there have been strangers in town asking questions, men with badges, claiming to be deputy marshals." Iris felt ice form in her stomach. "How many men?" "At least 4, maybe more. They're showing your photograph around, asking if anyone's seen you." He tied his horse to the hitching post with more force than necessary, offering cash rewards for information. "They're closing in," she said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "Seems like it." Wes studied her face, noting the way her chin lifted despite her fear. "Question is, what do we do about it?" "We?" she asked. "Wes, you don't understand. These aren't just bounty hunters looking for easy money. If my uncle sent deputy marshals, that means he's making this official. They have the law on their side." "Law's only as good as the men enforcing it," he said firmly. "And from what you've told me, your uncle's got no business wearing a badge. But if they find us here—" "They won't," he interrupted. "This cabin's hidden too well, and there are a dozen ways off this mountain that don't involve main trails. But we need to start thinking beyond just hiding." "What do you mean?" Wes was quiet for a moment, staring out at the peaks that surrounded them like protective walls. I mean, maybe it's time to stop running and start fighting back. How? I'm one woman with no proof, no allies, no resources. They have the entire territorial government behind them. You have the truth, he said simply, and you have me. That's not enough. Maybe not, he admitted, but it's a start, and sometimes that's all you need. That night, as they lay in their separate beds with the fire burning low between them, both were acutely aware of how much their world had changed. The safety of the hidden cabin no longer felt absolute. The law itself had become their enemy, turning even well-meaning citizens into potential threats. But something else had changed too. The careful distance they had maintained, the polite boundaries of their partnership, had begun to dissolve. When Wes had fastened the locket around her neck, when she had held his hands against her skin, they had crossed an invisible line that could not be uncrossed. "Wes!" Iris's voice was soft in the darkness. "Yeah? Are you afraid?" He was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. "I'm afraid of losing you," he said finally. "Everything else we can handle." Her heart stuttered at the admission. "You barely know me." "I know enough," he said. "I know you're brave and kind and stronger than you think. I know you see beauty in things other people overlook. I know you make me want to be better than I am. You're already better than any man I've ever known. That's not saying much, considering the men you've known." She laughed softly at that, a sound like water over stones. "True enough. Iris." "Yes? Whatever happens, I want you to know these have been the best days of my life. All of them, even the scary ones." "Mine too," she whispered, and meant it completely. Outside, the wind picked up, setting the pine boughs to sighing like voices, sharing secrets in the dark. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its pack, and the sound carried both wildness and belonging, danger and home. Iris touched the locket at her throat, feeling the slight roughness where Wes had repaired the chain. Her parents' faces smiled up at her from their wedding photograph, frozen in a moment of perfect happiness. They had found love against all odds, had built a life together that lasted until death finally parted them. Maybe, she thought as sleep began to claim her, love really could conquer all obstacles. Maybe some bonds were strong enough to survive even the worst that the world could throw at them. In the morning, she would face whatever came next with courage, born of newfound purpose. She had something worth fighting for now, not just her own life, but the possibility of a future filled with the kind of love her parents had shared. It was a fragile hope, precious as the silver locket that rested against her heart, but it was real. And sometimes, hope was the most powerful weapon of all. The Trading Post ledger lay open on Jake Morrison's scarred wooden counter, its pages filled with months of careful entries documenting every purchase, every transaction, every visitor who had passed through his establishment. Jake himself was a weathered man of 60-odd years, with the kind of steady gaze that came from seeing enough of life to know when trouble was brewing. They bought enough supplies for a week in the mountains, Jake told Wes quietly, glancing around to make sure no other customers were within earshot. Jerky, hardtack, coffee, ammunition. Asked about camping spots with water access. Wes studied the ledger entries, Jake pointed out, noting the precise handwriting that recorded the purchases. "How many men?" "4 that I saw, but there might be more." Jake's weathered fingers drummed against the counter. "Leader called himself Deputy Marshal Crawford. Showed me a badge that looked real enough, but badges can be bought or stolen." "What did they ask about exactly?" "You mostly." Jake's expression was troubled. "Wanted to know if you'd been coming to town regular-like, if you'd been asking questions or acting strange. Asked about anyone you might be protecting or hiding." A chill ran down Wes's spine. "What did you tell them?" "Told them you minded your own business and expected others to do the same." Jake closed the ledger with more force than necessary. "Told them I hadn't seen hide nor hair of any young woman matching their description." "And they believed you?" "Probably not," Jake admitted. "But they can't prove otherwise. And I made it clear I don't take kindly to folks who come into my territory asking too many questions about my customers. Wes nodded, grateful for the old man's loyalty. Jake Morrison had been running this trading post for 30 years, serving everyone from mountain men to traveling merchants to the occasional outlaw seeking supplies. He believed in discretion the way other men believed in religion, and his word was worth more than most people's written contracts. "There's something else," Jake said, lowering his voice even further. "One of them younger fellow with pale eyes, he had a wanted poster, not the regular one you showed me before. This one was different. Fresh printed, better picture, more details." "Different how?" "Higher reward for one thing. $1,000 now, instead of 500. Jake shook his head grimly. "And it specified, alive preferred, instead of dead or alive. That tells me they want to ask her questions before they kill her." Wes felt his jaw tighten. $1,000 would bring every bounty hunter and desperate man within 500 miles running. And the specification about taking her alive meant they planned to torture information out of her, probably about those documents she had mentioned. The proof of corruption that could bring down her uncle and his criminal associates. How long ago did they leave? "Yesterday morning, heading up the North Trail toward Copper Creek." Jake paused, studying Wes's face. "You're not thinking of going after them, are you?" "Thinking about it." "That would be suicide," Jake said bluntly. "4 armed men with badges and legal authority, and you're just one hunter with a bow and a stubborn streak. Sometimes one is enough, if he knows the territory." Jake was quiet for a moment, then reached under the counter and pulled out a cloth-wrapped bundle. "If you're determined to be a fool, at least be a well-armed fool." Inside the cloth was a Colt revolver with a worn but well-maintained holster, along with 2 boxes of ammunition. The gun was obviously old, but had been cared for with the devotion of a man who understood that his life might depend on his weapon's reliability. "I can't pay you for this," Wes said. "Didn't ask you to," Jake replied. "Consider it a loan. You can return it when this is all over." Wes strapped on the gun belt, feeling the unfamiliar weight of the weapon against his hip. He had carried firearms during his younger years, before the mountains had called him to a simpler way of life, but the bow had become his weapon of choice for its silence and his own skill with it. "There's one more thing," Jake said as Wes prepared to leave. "The pale-eyed one Crawford's second in command. He asked specific questions about your cabin. Wanted to know if anyone knew exactly where you lived, if there were maps or guides who could lead them there." "And?" "Nobody knows except me and maybe old Henry Spotted Wolf, and Henry's been dead 2 winters now." Jake's expression was grim. "But that doesn't mean they can't find it eventually. These mountains are big, but they're not infinite." As Wes rode back toward his hidden canyon, his mind raced through possibilities and plans. 4 men with government backing and a $1,000 bounty would be persistent and dangerous. They would search every valley, check every cabin, question every person they encountered. Eventually, their methodical approach would lead them to the right area, and then it would only be a matter of time. He found Iris exactly where he had left her, sitting in the afternoon sunshine outside the cabin, with her journal open on her lap, working on a detailed sketch of a mountain jay that had landed nearby. The scene was so peaceful, so perfectly domestic, that for a moment he almost didn't want to shatter it with bad news. But she looked up at his approach and immediately read trouble in his expression. "What's happened?" He dismounted and told her everything: the increased reward, the specifications about taking her alive, the 4 men who were already combing the mountains for signs of their hideout. She listened without interruption, her face growing paler with each detail. $1,000, she said when he finished. "That changes everything." "It means we can't trust anyone," Wes agreed, "not even people who might normally mind their own business. That much money makes liars and betrayers out of honest folks." She closed her journal and stood, brushing dirt from her skirt. "Then we have to leave. Today." "Running won't solve this," Wes said gently. "They'll just follow us to the next hiding place, and the next. Eventually, we'll run out of places to run." "Then what do you suggest?" "We go on the offensive. The words came out harder than he intended, carrying echoes of a younger, more violent version of himself. We stop letting them hunt us and start hunting them. Iris stared at him, seeing something in his eyes that hadn't been there before, a cold calculation that spoke of experience with violence, of knowledge about how to kill efficiently and without remorse. "You're talking about murder." "I'm talking about survival," he corrected. "They're not going to stop coming, Iris. Your uncle's too deep in this corruption to let you live, and now he's got the law backing his play. The only way this ends is if we make it end. But if we kill deputy marshals, if they're really deputy marshals, then we're already dead," he pointed out. "But I'm betting they're hired guns with fancy badges, the same kind of men who killed Thomas Kellerman. The law won't protect us, so we have to protect ourselves." She was quiet for a long time, staring out at the peaks that had become both sanctuary and prison. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady but sad. "This isn't what I wanted. When I dreamed of freedom, I didn't imagine it would require so much violence." "Freedom always costs blood," Wes said softly. "The only question is whose blood gets spilled. And if we do this, if we fight back and somehow win, what then? Do we spend the rest of our lives looking over our shoulders, waiting for the next group of hunters to find us?" "Maybe," he admitted. "Or maybe we find those documents you mentioned, the proof of your uncle's corruption. Maybe we expose the whole rotten system and clear your name for good. The documents are in Denver, hidden in a place only Thomas and I knew about. Getting to them would mean going back into the heart of enemy territory." "Then that's what we do." She turned to look at him, seeing the determination in his face, the way his hand rested naturally on the grip of the gun Jake had given him. "You'd do that? Risk everything to help me clear my name?" "I'd do anything for you," he said simply. "Anything at all." The words hung in the air between them like a promise and a confession. They had been moving toward this moment for days, circling around feelings that had grown too strong to deny. Now, with danger closing in and their future uncertain, the careful boundaries they had maintained seemed suddenly meaningless. "Wes," she began, but he held up a hand. "I know this isn't the time or place," he said. "I know you're dealing with more than any person should have to handle. But I need you to know, whatever happens, however this ends, you've changed everything for me. These mountains used to be my whole world, but now they're just the place where I found you." Tears spilled over her cheeks, but she was smiling. "You beautiful, impossible man. Don't you know I feel the same way?" He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his grey eyes, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his skin. "Do you?" Instead of answering with words, she rose on her toes and kissed him. It was meant to be soft, gentle, a brief acknowledgement of feelings too deep for speech. But the moment their lips touched, something ignited between them all, the fear and longing and desperate hope of the past week, crystallizing into a need that bordered on desperation. His arms came around her, pulling her against him as if he could protect her from the entire world through sheer force of will. She melted into his embrace, feeling safer and more complete than she had ever felt in her life. This was what she had been running toward, without knowing it, not just freedom from her past, but freedom to love without reservation, to be loved in return by a man who would die before letting harm come to her. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard, their faces flushed with more than just mountain air. "Now that," Wes said softly, "was worth waiting for. Was it everything you imagined?" "Better," he said, touching her face with fingers that trembled slightly. "Much better." The sun was beginning to set behind the peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that matched the fire in Iris's hair. Somewhere in the distance, the sound of horses moving through timber drifted on the evening breeze, too distant to be an immediate threat, but close enough to remind them that their peaceful interlude was borrowed time. "They're out there," Iris said, hearing the same sounds that had caught Wes's attention. "Let them come," he replied, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. "I've got something worth fighting for now." As they stood together in the dying light, holding each other close while danger circled like wolves in the darkness, both understood that everything was about to change. The quiet days of learning and growing closer were over. What came next would test not just their survival skills, but the strength of the bond that had formed between them. But for this moment, this single perfect moment before the storm broke, they had each other, and sometimes that was enough to face whatever darkness waited ahead. The mountain map had been drawn by a surveyor named Marcus Webb in 1863, commissioned by the territorial government to chart the maze of canyons and ridges that made up this remote section of the Colorado Rockies. What made it invaluable wasn't just its accuracy, but the details Webb had included: every cave, every hidden trail, every water source that could mean the difference between life and death for someone who knew how to read the land. Wes had acquired the map 3 years earlier from Webb's widow, who had been selling her late husband's effects to pay for passage back east. Most folks would have seen just lines and symbols on yellowed paper, but to someone who lived these mountains every day, it was a treasure beyond price. The caves Webb had marked with careful precision offered shelter from storms, concealment from enemies, and emergency supplies for those wise enough to cache them in advance. "Here," Wes said, spreading the map across the cabin's wooden table as dawn light filtered through the windows. "These 3 caves form a triangle about 5 miles from here, close enough that we can reach any of them in a few hours, far enough apart that if one is discovered, the others remain secret." Iris studied the intricate markings, noting how Webb had indicated not just the location of each cave, but details about their size, accessibility, and proximity to water sources. "You've been planning this for a while. Man doesn't survive 7 years alone in the wilderness without thinking about contingencies," Wes replied. "I've got supplies cached in all 3 caves: food, ammunition, medical supplies, everything we'd need to disappear for weeks if necessary." "And you think these deputy marshals won't find them?" "Webb's survey was never published," Wes explained. "Too expensive, and the territorial government decided the area was too remote to bother with. As far as I know, this is the only copy of this map still in existence." The caves formed what Webb had labeled Devil's Triangle on his map, a reference to the treacherous terrain that surrounded them and the ease with which travelers could become lost in the maze of identical-looking deep canyons. What made them perfect hiding places also made them dangerous. One wrong turn could lead to dead ends or unstable rock formations that had claimed more than one life over the years. But Wes knew these mountains like other men knew the rooms of their houses. Every landmark, every trail marker, every subtle change in vegetation that indicated water or game, all of it, was catalogued in his memory with the precision of a man whose life depended on such knowledge. "We'll take what we can carry," he continued, pointing to a route marked in faded ink across the map. "Leave everything else behind. If they find the cabin, they'll find empty rooms and cold ashes. When do we leave?" "Tonight, after dark. Give us the best chance of moving unseen." He rolled up the map carefully, treating it with the reverence it deserved. "But first, there's something else we need to discuss." The gravity in his voice made Iris look up sharply. "What?" "You're shooting," he said bluntly. "You're improving with the bow. But if we're going to face armed men, you need to know how to handle a pistol." The idea of actually shooting at another human being made her stomach clench, but she forced herself to nod. "Teach me." They spent the morning in a secluded valley behind the cabin, far enough from any trails that the sound of gunshots wouldn't carry to unwanted ears. Wes had brought his father's old Coulter cap and ball revolver that had seen service in the war between the states, and he taught her the fundamentals with the same patient precision he had used for archery. "Shooting a man isn't like shooting game," he said as she struggled to hit a target made from pine bark. "Game doesn't shoot back, doesn't move deliberately to make you miss, doesn't use cover and concealment to survive. When the time comes, and it will come, you can't hesitate. Hesitation will get you killed." "Have you killed men before?" she asked quietly. Wes was silent for a long moment, his face unreadable. "Yes. Many." "Enough." He adjusted her grip on the pistol, his hands steady and sure. "During the war, mostly. A few times since, when decent folks needed protecting from the kind of men who prey on the innocent. Does it get easier? No, he said firmly. And the day it does is the day you need to question what you've become. Taking a life should never be easy, but sometimes it's necessary. The trick is knowing the difference. By noon, Iris could hit the target more often than she missed, though her hands still shook slightly each time she pulled the trigger. The recoil was substantial, and the noise was deafening even in the open air, but she was learning to compensate for both. "You'll do," Wes said finally, watching her reload the cylinder with growing confidence. "Remember, in a real fight, you won't have time to think. Trust your instincts and shoot center mass. Don't try for fancy shots or warning shots. If you draw that gun, it's because you intend to kill." That afternoon brought the first real test of their preparations. Iris was inside the cabin, packing essential supplies into a leather satchel, when Wes burst through the door with his rifle in his hands and urgency written across his face. "Riders," he said tersely. "3 of them, coming up the main trail. Could be anyone, but we can't take chances." Iris finished, her training with the pistol suddenly feeling inadequate. "How long do we have?" 10 minutes, maybe 15 if they stop to study tracks. Wes was already moving, grabbing his bow and quiver while Iris secured her journal and the precious map. "We go out the back, up the ridge to the first cache. If they find the cabin empty, maybe they'll move on. And if they don't, then we find out how well you learned your lessons." They slipped out the cabin's rear window and moved carefully up the steep slope behind the building, using pine trees and rock outcroppings for concealment. Wes led the way, his movements silent and sure, while Iris followed as quietly as she could manage. Her heart was pounding so hard she was certain the riders below would hear it, but her breathing remained steady and controlled. From their elevated position, they could see the 3 horsemen as they approached the cabin. They moved with the careful alertness of men expecting trouble, their hands resting on their weapons, their eyes constantly scanning the surrounding terrain. The leader was a tall man with a black beard, while his companions were younger and leaner, with the hungry look of wolves seeking prey. "Deputy marshals," Iris whispered. "Maybe," Wes replied, studying them through a gap in the pine boughs. "Or maybe just opportunists looking to collect that $1,000 reward." The men dismounted near the cabin's front door, and the bearded leader gestured for his companions to circle around to the back while he approached the entrance directly. They moved with practiced coordination, suggesting military or law enforcement training. "Professional," Wes murmured, "not just bounty hunters." The leader kicked in the cabin door with casual violence, disappearing inside, while his men maintained watch outside. Minutes passed like hours as they waited to see what would happen next. When the bearded man emerged, his face was grim with frustration. He called out something to his companions, and all 3 began examining the ground around the cabin, looking for tracks that might indicate which direction their quarry had gone. "They're good," Wes admitted grudgingly. "Look at how they're reading the signs." One of the younger men pointed toward the ridge where they were hiding, apparently having noticed the faint trail they had left in their hasty retreat. The leader nodded and began climbing, his rifle ready, while his companions spread out to cover more ground. "Time to go," Wes said urgently. They retreated deeper into the forest, moving as quickly as silence would allow. Behind them, they could hear the sounds of pursuit boots on stone, the occasional snap of a broken branch, the low murmur of voices coordinating their search. The first cache was hidden in a cave entrance concealed by a rockfall that looked natural but had been carefully arranged by Wes years earlier. To reach it required navigating a narrow ledge that would be treacherous for anyone unfamiliar with the route, but Wes led the way with the confidence of long practice. Inside the cave, supplies waited exactly as he had left them: dried food, ammunition, blankets, medical supplies, and a spare rifle wrapped in oiled canvas. It wasn't luxury, but it would keep them alive for weeks if necessary. "How many of these caches do you have?" Iris asked as they settled in to wait out their pursuers. 7 in total, Wes replied. "Took me 3 years to stock them all properly. Each one has different supplies depending on the location and what you might need there." You really did think of everything. I tried to. He moved to the cave entrance, listening for sounds of pursuit. But I never planned on having someone else to protect. Changes the calculations. I can take care of myself. I know you can, he said, turning back to her with something like pride in his eyes. But that doesn't mean I want you to have to. Outside, the sounds of search had grown fainter, suggesting their pursuers had lost the trail, but Wes knew better than to assume they had given up. Men like these would be methodical and persistent, checking every possible hiding place until they found what they were looking for. We stay here tonight, he decided. Move to the second cache tomorrow, if the coast is clear. As darkness fell and the temperature dropped, they huddled together for warmth in the cave's depths, sharing body heat and quiet conversation. The intimate necessity of survival had brought them physically closer than propriety might normally allow. But under the circumstances, such concerns seemed meaningless. Wes! Iris's voice was soft in the darkness. Yeah? After we get through this, after we clear my name and deal with my uncle, what then? Where do we go from here? He was quiet for a moment, considering possibilities he hadn't dared to hope for. I was thinking maybe we could build a new cabin, somewhere even more remote, where we could live in peace. Together? If you'll have me, he said carefully. I know I'm not much of a catch, just a mountain man with more scars than sense. You're everything I never knew I wanted, she said simply. Everything I never knew I needed. Even if it means a hard life, no servants, no fine dresses, no society gatherings. Especially then, she replied. I tried that life, remember? It nearly killed me in a different way. They talked quietly through the long hours of the night, sharing dreams and fears while keeping watch for signs of their pursuers. By dawn, they had made plans that extended far beyond mere survival plans for a future, together in a place where the past couldn't reach them, where love could grow without the shadow of violence and pursuit. But first, they had to live long enough to make those dreams reality, and with armed men combing the mountains in search of them, survival was far from certain. As the sun rose over the peaks, painting the sky in shades of hope and determination, both knew that the easy part of their ordeal was over. What came next would test not just their skills and courage, but the very foundation of the bond they had forged in the wilderness. The hunt was far from over, but now, for the first time, they had something more powerful than fear driving them forward. They had love worth fighting for, and a future worth the risk of everything. The tarnished sheriff's badge lay in the palm of Wes's hand, like a piece of his own buried past, its brass surface worn smooth by years of handling and darkened by time and neglect. He had found it among the belongings of the dead bounty hunter from 3 days earlier, the pale-eyed man who had spoken of bosses and orders before Wes's arrow had silenced him forever. What made the badge significant wasn't its age or condition, but the name engraved on its back in letters so small they were barely visible. Deputy W. Calder, Territorial Rangers, 1868. That's your name, Iris said quietly, reading the inscription over his shoulder as they crouched in the shelter of their second cache. A shallow cave overlooking a narrow valley where morning mist clung to the pine boughs like spirits. It was my badge. Wes confirmed, his voice hollow with shock and something darker. I carried it for 3 years before I threw it in a creek outside Kansas City and swore I'd never pin on another one. You were a lawman. Territorial Ranger, he said, as if the words tasted bitter. We were supposed to be the elite federal marshals who could cross jurisdictional lines, pursue criminals anywhere in the territories, bring justice to places where local law couldn't or wouldn't reach. Iris studied his face, seeing pain there that went deeper than anything she had witnessed before. What happened? Wes was quiet for a long time, staring at the badge as if it were a snake that might bite him. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of old guilt and carefully buried rage. I had a partner, Samuel Crawford. We worked together for 2 years, and I trusted him with my life more times than I could count. He closed his fingers around the badge, making a fist. Turns out he was selling that trust to the highest bidder. Crawford, Iris repeated, recognition dawning. Jake Morrison said the leader of those deputy marshals called himself Crawford. Same man, Wes confirmed grimly. Which means this isn't just about your uncle's corruption, this is personal. The story came out in fragments, like pieces of broken glass, that cut him with each retelling. Crawford had been working with criminal organizations throughout the territories, using his badge and authority to protect their operations while appearing to investigate them. He would arrest their competitors, intimidate witnesses, and ensure that evidence disappeared before it could reach trial. I found out by accident, Wes said. Came back to our camp unexpectedly and overheard him talking to a man I recognized, outlaw named Dutch Henry, who was supposed to be dead, killed in a shootout 6 months earlier. Only he wasn't dead, and Crawford was taking money to keep it that way. What did you do? What I thought was right, Wes replied bitterly. I confronted him, tried to arrest him, told him he was going to face justice for betraying his oath. We fought, and I left him for dead in that camp. But he survived. Obviously, though from the looks of things, he's been carrying a grudge all these years. Wes opened his hand again, studying the badge with eyes full of old pain. I threw this away because I thought the whole system was rotten, that there was no point in trying to serve justice through corrupt institutions. Looks like I was right. Iris was quiet for a moment, processing the implications of this revelation. So when those men came for me, it wasn't just about the bounty. Crawford saw a chance for revenge. Must have, Wes agreed. Your uncle probably hired him legitimately, not knowing about our history. But the moment Crawford realized who was protecting you, it became about settling old scores. Which means he won't stop until one of you is dead. That's about the size of it. The morning sun was climbing higher, burning off the mist and revealing the stark beauty of the mountain landscape spread out below them. But the peaceful scene felt like a mockery now, knowing that somewhere in these same mountains, men were hunting them with personal vendettas that went far beyond mere money. There's something else, Iris said hesitantly, something I haven't told you about my uncle. Wes looked at her sharply, hearing a new note in her voice mixed with shame and reluctance. When I was younger, maybe 15 or 16, Uncle William used to visit our house regularly. My parents thought he was just being a good brother, maintaining family connections. She wrapped her arms around herself as if suddenly cold. But when they weren't around, he would look at me in ways that made my skin crawl. He would find excuses to touch Memmy's hand, my shoulder, my face, and he would make comments about how I was growing into a beautiful young woman. Wes felt a cold rage building in his chest, the kind of fury that had made him dangerous as a younger man. Did he? No, she said quickly. My parents never left me alone with him. And after my father caught him watching me change clothes through a window, Uncle William was banned from the house. I thought that was the end of it. But it wasn't. When my parents died and I had to go live with him, I was terrified. But he was different, then cold, distant, completely proper. I thought maybe he had changed, or maybe I had imagined the earlier incidents. She shuddered at the memory. I realize now that he was just biding his time, waiting for the right opportunity. The engagement, Wes said, understanding flooding through him, to the banker's son, Henry Kellerman, Thomas Kellerman's nephew. Iris's voice was barely above a whisper. Uncle William arranged the entire thing. Said it would secure my financial future, give me stability and respectability. But I think the real reason was that it would put me under the control of a man he could manipulate. And Thomas Kellerman found out about the corruption and tried to stop it, which would have exposed Uncle William's plans for me along with everything else. She looked at him with eyes full of pain. I think he's been planning this for years, Wes. The corruption, the murders, even my Fremenjits, all connected to his obsession with controlling me. The full scope of the conspiracy was becoming clear now, like pieces of a puzzle finally clicking into place. William Monroe hadn't just been taking bribes from criminals, she had been building an entire network of corruption that would allow him to eliminate anyone who threatened his plans, including his own niece if she refused to cooperate. He hired Crawford not just to bring you back, but to make sure you never had the chance to expose him, Wes said. and Crawford saw it as an opportunity to get revenge on me at the same time. Two birds with one stone. Something like that. Wes tucked the badge into his shirt pocket, close to his heart, where it would remind him of what was at stake. But they made one mistake. What's that? They assumed I was still the same man who threw away his badge 7 years ago, he said, and his voice carried an edge that would have made Crawford himself nervous. They assumed I'd lost the killer instinct that made me dangerous in the first place. And have you? Wes looked at her, really looked at her, taking in the courage in her green eyes, the way she held herself, despite everything she had endured, the quiet strength that had drawn him to her from the beginning. Then he thought about men like Crawford and William Monroe, predators who used their power to hurt innocent people, who corrupted everything they touched in pursuit of their own twisted desires. No, he said quietly. I haven't lost it. I just needed a good reason to find it again. The sound of horses moving through the valley below interrupted their conversation. 4 riders were making their way along the creek bed, moving slowly and studying the ground for tracks. Even at this distance, Iris could make out the tall figure of the bearded man who had searched their cabin, Crawford himself, no doubt, leading his men in their methodical hunt. They're persistent, she observed. They're professionals, Wes corrected. The kind of men who don't give up just because the trail goes cold. We're going to have to be smarter than them, not just faster or better hidden. What do you have in mind? Time to stop playing defense and start playing offense, he said, checking his rifle and the Colt at his hip. They want to hunt us like animals? Fine. But they're about to learn the difference between hunting prey and hunting predators. Meaning it's time to turn the tables. Instead of running from them, we're going to start hunting them. His smile was cold and predatory, reminiscent of the dangerous young ranger he had once been. And unlike them, we know these mountains well enough to disappear whenever we want to. As they watched the riders below continue their search, both understood that everything had changed. This was no longer just about clearing Iris's name or escaping pursuit. It had become personal in ways that demanded resolution, a final accounting between men who had once been partners and were now enemies. The badge in Wes's pocket felt like a weight and a promise, a reminder of the oath he had once taken to protect the innocent and serve justice, even when the law itself had been corrupted beyond recognition. He had thrown it away once in disgust and disillusionment, but perhaps it was time to reclaim what it truly meant to wear such a symbol. Not the corrupt authority that men like Crawford and Monroe represented, but the deeper commitment to right and wrong that had drawn him to law enforcement in the first place. The commitment to protect people like Iris from predators who would use their power to cause harm. The hunt was about to begin in earnest, but this time Wes Calder would be the one doing the hunting. And he intended to finish what Samuel Crawford had started all those years ago in a camp outside Kansas City. Some debts could only be paid in blood, and the time for payment had finally come. The war paint felt strange on Wes's skin after so many years, the mixture of red clay and berry juice, bringing back memories he had tried to forget. His grandmother had been Cheyenne, and she had taught him the old ways during summers spent on the reservation before the world changed, and such knowledge became dangerous to possess. The patterns he painted on his face, no angular lines that spoke of the hawk and the wolf, symbols of hunting and cunning, were older than the white man's law, older than badges and corruption, and the twisted desires of men like Crawford and Monroe. You look different, Iris said softly, watching him apply the final touches by the light of their small fire deep within the third cache. A spacious cavern that had once sheltered his Cheyenne ancestors during their own times of war. I am different, Wes replied, studying his reflection in the still water of an underground pool. The face that looked back at him was part mountain man, part territorial ranger, part Cheyenne warrior, all the pieces of his identity finally coming together for what might be the last time. This is who I was before I learned to hide from what I am. And what are you? A hunter, he said simply, the kind that doesn't let prey escape. They had spent 2 days preparing for what was to come, moving between the caches and observing Crawford's men as they methodically searched the mountains. 4 men total, just as Jake Morrison had reported Crawford himself, 2 younger deputies who moved with military precision, and a 4th man who looked more like a hired killer than any kind of lawman. Wes had mapped their patterns, their routes, their habits. Crawford was smart and experienced, but he was also arrogant. He assumed his quarry would continue running, continue hiding, continue behaving like frightened prey. That assumption would be his downfall. "The plan is simple," Wes explained as he checked his weapons one final time. "We take them one at a time, separating them from the group and eliminating the threat. Start with the weakest link and work our way up to Crawford." "Which one is the weakest link?" "The hired gunman named Voss, according to the wanted posters I've seen. He's dangerous in a straight fight, but he's not used to this kind of terrain. Keeps to the valleys, avoids the high ridges where the air gets thin. That makes him predictable." Iris nodded, though her face was pale in the firelight. She had proven herself capable with both bow and pistol, but taking human life was still a theoretical concept for her. Wes hoped it would remain that way, hoped he could handle the killing himself and spare her that particular burden. "What about the others?" "The 2 deputies are brothers Tim and Jake Crawford, Samuel's nephews. Good men who've been led astray by family loyalty. I'll try to give them a chance to walk away, but if they won't take it..." He shrugged, the gesture carrying grim finality. "And Crawford himself?" "Crawford dies," Wes said without hesitation. "No quarter, no mercy, no chance for redemption. He's had 7 years to change his ways, and instead he's gotten worse. Some men can't be saved, only stopped." The war paint wasn't just ceremonial, it was practical camouflage that would help him blend with the shadows and rocks, making him nearly invisible to men who didn't know how to read the wilderness properly. Combined with his intimate knowledge of every trail and hiding place in these mountains, it would make him a ghost that struck without warning and vanished without trace. As dawn approached, they made their final preparations. Iris would remain in the cavern, protected by its concealment and equipped with enough supplies to survive for weeks if something went wrong. Wes would go alone to begin the hunt, relying on stealth and surprise to even the odds against 4 armed men. "I should be going with you," Iris said as he prepared to leave. "You should be staying alive," he corrected gently. "That's the most important thing you can do right now. But if something happens to you, then you wait 3 days and ride for the territorial capital. Tell them everything about your uncle, about Crawford, about the corruption. Give them this." He pressed the tarnished badge into her hands, along with a sealed letter he had written during the night. "That's my confession, my account of what Crawford did 7 years ago and what he's doing now. It might not be enough to clear your name completely, but it'll be a start." She stared at the badge, seeing her own fearful reflection in its worn surface. "I don't want this to be goodbye." "It's not goodbye," he said firmly, taking her face in his hands. "It's see you soon. I didn't survive 7 years alone in these mountains just to die now, when I finally have something worth living for." He kissed her then, pouring all his love and determination into the contact. When they broke apart, both were crying tears of fear and hope, mixed together like rain and sunshine. "I love you," she whispered. "I love you too," he replied, "and that's why I have to do this. Some fights can't be avoided, only won or lost. This is one of those fights." The sun was just beginning to paint the eastern peaks with gold when Wes slipped out of the cavern and began his descent toward the valley where Crawford's men had made their camp. He moved like a shadow among the rocks and trees, his moccasined feet silent on stone and pine needle, his war-painted face invisible in the dappled light. Voss was exactly where Wes had expected to find him, standing guard at the mouth of a narrow canyon while his companions searched the higher ground. The hired killer was alert but focused on the wrong threats, watching for movement along the obvious approaches while ignoring the steep cliffs that supposedly offered no avenue of attack. Wes approached from above, moving with infinite patience along ledges that would have terrified most men. The war paint seemed to awaken something primal in him, stripping away years of civilization and revealing the predator that had always lurked beneath the surface. This was what he had been bred for, what his mixed heritage had designed him to doe-hunt dangerous prey in impossible terrain, with nothing but skill and cunning as weapons. Voss never knew he was there until the arrow took him through the heart from above, the broadhead punching through leather and flesh with a sound like striking wood. He died silently, efficiently, his body toppling forward into the creek that ran through the canyon floor. 1 down, 3 to go. The Cheyenne had taught that every kill in war was both victory and tragedy. Victory because the enemy was eliminated, tragedy because another soul had been sent to the spirit world before its time. Wes felt that duality now as he recovered his arrow and began moving toward his next target. Voss had been a killer for hire, a man who had chosen violence as his profession, but he had also been someone's son, perhaps someone's father. His death was necessary, but not celebrated. Tim Crawford was searching a box canyon half a mile away, moving methodically through the boulder field at its base, while his brother Jake covered the entrance. They were good better than Voss had been, but they were also predictable in their thoroughness. Wes had been watching them for 2 days and knew their patterns as well as they did. He positioned himself on the canyon rim and waited. Tim was working his way deeper into the dead end, following tracks that Wes had deliberately left the previous night. When the young deputy was far enough from help, Wes made his move. The first arrow took Tim in the shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him to his knees. Not a killing shot, Wes still hoped to give the brothers a chance to withdraw from this fight. "Tim!" Jake's voice echoed off the canyon walls as he rushed toward his wounded brother. "I've got your brother in my sights," Wes called out, his voice carrying clearly in the thin mountain air. "You've got one chance to walk away from this. Take him and ride out of here, and I'll let you both live." "Who are you?" Jake shouted back, his rifle swinging toward the sound of Wes's voice. "Someone who remembers when wearing a badge meant something," Wes replied. "Your uncle's forgotten that lesson. Don't make the same mistake. We've got a legal warrant for the woman's arrest. You've got a piece of paper signed by a corrupt sheriff who's been taking bribes for years," Wes corrected. "That's not the same thing as justice." Jake was torn between loyalty to family and the growing realization that they might be on the wrong side of this fight. In the end, blood won out over conscience, usually did. "Uncle Sam's been good to us," Jake called out. "We're not abandoning him now." "Then you're choosing to die with him," Wes said sadly, and his second arrow took Jake through the throat before the young man could raise his rifle. Tim Crawford tried to crawl toward his brother's body, but the shoulder wound had weakened him, and there was nowhere to go in the dead-end canyon. When Wes dropped down from the rim, moving with the silent grace of his warrior ancestors, Tim's face went white with recognition. "You're Calder," he gasped. "The ranger who tried to kill Uncle Sam." "The ranger who should have finished the job 7 years ago," Wes corrected. "I'm not making that mistake twice." "Please," Tim whispered, blood soaking through his shirt from the arrow wound. "I've got a wife, children back in Kansas City. I was just following orders." "So was I once upon a time," Wes said gently. "But some orders are wrong, and following them makes you wrong too." The knife was quick and merciful, sliding between ribs to find the heart with surgical precision. Tim Crawford died without pain, which was more kindness than his uncle deserved, but appropriate for a young man who had been led astray rather than choosing evil deliberately. 2 down, 1 to go. Crawford himself was the most dangerous of his hunters, experienced, intelligent, and utterly ruthless in pursuit of his goals. He was also the most personal enemy Wes had ever faced, a man whose betrayal had cost him his faith in law and justice and driven him into 7 years of self-imposed exile. Finding Crawford proved to be more difficult than eliminating his men. The corrupt marshal was smart enough to vary his patterns, to avoid predictable routes, to use the terrain and his military training to make himself a challenging target. For hours, Wes stalked through the mountains without catching sight of his quarry, following sign that grew increasingly cold as the day wore on. It was nearly sunset when he realized the truth. Crawford wasn't hiding from him anymore. The experienced marshal had found the bodies of his men and understood that the hunt had been reversed. Now he was hunting the hunter, using Wes's own aggressive tactics against him. The ambush came just as Wes emerged from a stand of aspen trees into a small meadow ringed by granite outcroppings. Crawford's rifle spoke from concealment, the bullet passing so close to Wes's head that he felt its wind. Only his warrior instinct saved him, throwing him sideways into a rolling dive that carried him behind the meager shelter of a fallen log. "Hello, Wesley," Crawford called out, his voice carrying the same easy confidence it had possessed 7 years earlier. "Been a long time, partner." "Not long enough, Sam," Wes replied, pinpointing the marshal's location by the sound of his voice. "Though I see you've learned some new tricks." "Had to, after you tried to murder me in my sleep," Crawford said. "Took me 6 months to recover from what you did to me that night." "Should have taken you 6 feet of dirt," Wes called back. "My mistake for being merciful." The conversation was tactical as well as personal, each man trying to keep the other talking while maneuvering for a better shot. Wes was at a disadvantage in the open meadow, but he had advantages of his own. The war paint and his knowledge of these specific mountains gave him options that Crawford couldn't anticipate. "You know, I always wondered what happened to you after that night," Crawford continued. "Heard you threw away your badge and disappeared. Some folks said you'd gone native. Others figured you'd drunk yourself to death in some frontier saloon. Disappointed to find out I'm still breathing?" "Not really," Crawford admitted. "Means I get the satisfaction of finishing what we started, and this time there won't be any mistakes." The second shot came from a different position, forcing Wes to scramble for new cover. Crawford was moving between the granite outcroppings, using them as shields while he tried to get a clear shot at his target. It was good tactics, the kind of methodical approach that had made him dangerous as a ranger. But Wes had learned new tricks too during his years in the mountains. The Cheyenne way of war wasn't about standing and trading shots, it was about becoming one with the landscape, using the terrain itself as a weapon. He began to climb, moving up the steep rock face that formed one side of the meadow. Crawford's shots followed him, chipping stone and sending fragments flying. But the marshal was shooting upward at a difficult angle, while Wes used every crack and crevice for protection. "You can't run forever, Wesley," Crawford shouted, frustration creeping into his voice. "These mountains aren't big enough to hide in." Wes didn't reply. He was saving his breath for the climb and his words for when they would have maximum impact. At the top of the rock face, he found what he was looking for, a large boulder balanced precariously on the edge, held in place by smaller stones that could be dislodged with careful pressure. The Cheyenne had called it making the mountain fight for you, using the natural forces of gravity and geology as allies in battle. It required patience and precise timing, but when done correctly, it could bring down avalanches that buried entire war parties. Crawford was still moving among the granite outcroppings below, searching for a shot at a target he thought was pinned down. He never looked up to see the shadow falling toward him until it was too late. The boulder crashed into the meadow with the force of thunder, followed by a cascade of smaller rocks and debris. Crawford's scream was cut short by the sound of stone meeting flesh, and then there was only silence broken by the settling of disturbed earth. Wes climbed down carefully, his heart pounding not from exertion, but from the realization that it was over. 7 years of running from his past, 7 years of trying to forget what Samuel Crawford had done to his faith in justice. All of it was finished now, buried under tons of Colorado granite. Crawford was still alive when Wes reached him, pinned beneath the boulder, but conscious enough to recognize his former partner. Blood frothed at the corners of his mouth, and his legs were crushed beyond any hope of healing. "Always were too clever for your own good," Crawford gasped, trying to smile despite the pain. "Should have known you'd find a way to make the mountain do your killing for you." "Seemed appropriate," Wes replied, kneeling beside the dying man. "You always like to let other people do your dirty work. This doesn't change anything, you know," Crawford said, his voice growing weaker with each word. "The woman's still wanted, still guilty in the eyes of the law. Killing me doesn't make her innocent." Maybe not, Wes agreed, but it makes sure you can't hurt anyone else. Crawford's laugh turned into a cough that brought up more blood. You think I'm the only one? You think Sheriff Monroe doesn't have other allies, other resources? This is just the beginning, Wesley. You've won one battle, but the war's far from over. Then we'll fight the next battle when it comes, Wes said, and the one after that if necessary. Always the idealist, Crawford wheezed. That's what made you dangerous as a ranger, and it's what'll get you killed as an outlaw. Maybe, but I'd rather die fighting for something I believe in than live serving something I don't. Crawford's eyes were glazing over, but he managed one last words. See you in hell, partner. I'll be the one in war paint, Wes replied, but Crawford was already gone. As the last light faded from the western sky, Wes began the long journey back to the cavern where Iris waited. His war paint was streaked with sweat and dust. His body ached from the climb and the fight, but his heart was lighter than it had been in years. The immediate threat was ended. Crawford and his men would never hunt again, never hurt innocent people in service of corrupt masters. But as the dying marshal had pointed out, this was only one battle in a larger war. Sheriff Monroe was still in Denver, still protected by his network of corruption, still obsessed with controlling his niece. The real fight was just beginning. But for the first time since this whole ordeal started, Wes felt like they had a chance of winning it. They had each other, they had the truth, and they had the determination to see justice done no matter what the cost. Some wars were worth fighting, even when the odds seemed impossible. Some people were worth dying for, even when survival meant living with injustice. As he climbed toward the hidden cavern where love waited in the darkness, Wes Calder carried the hope that maybe, just maybe, they could build something beautiful from the ashes of their enemy's defeat. The mountains had claimed 4 more souls today, but they had also set 2 souls free. Freedom always cost blood. But sometimes, when the cause was just and the love was true, that blood bought something precious enough to make the price worthwhile. The hunting knife had been his father's, and his father's before that, passed down through 3 generations of Caldermen like a sacred trust. Its blade was Damascus steel, folded and refolded, until the metal held patterns like flowing water, strong enough to pierce bone, yet delicate enough for the finest work. The handle was carved from elk antler, worn smooth by decades of hands that had wielded it in defense of what mattered most. Wes touched the knife's grip as he approached the cavern where Iris waited, drawing comfort from its familiar weight against his hip. The war paint was still drying on his face, and his hands still carried the scent of death, but Crawford and his men were finished. The immediate threat was ended. Or so he thought until he saw the horses. 6 cavalry mounts stood tethered near the cavern entrance, their military saddles and branded flanks marking them as property of the territorial government. Fresh tracks in the muddy ground told a story that made his blood run cold. More men had arrived while he was hunting Crawford, and they had found the hidden cave where Iris was supposed to be safe. Wes approached with infinite care, his bow strung and ready, every sense alert for signs of ambush. The silence was wrong too complete, too ominous. Even the birds had stopped singing, as if the very forest held its breath in anticipation of violence. From inside the cavern came the sound of voices, muffled by rock and distance, but unmistakably present. One of them was Iris, her tone defiant, despite what must be desperate circumstances. The others were male, official, carrying the authoritative cadence of men accustomed to being obeyed. "Told you already, I don't know where he is," Iris was saying as Wes crept closer to the entrance. "He left this morning and didn't say when he'd be back." "Miss Monroe, you're only making this harder on yourself," another voice replied, older, gravelly, with a slight southern accent. "We have a legal warrant for your arrest, signed by both the territorial governor and your uncle. You can come quietly, or we can drag you out in chains. Either way, you're coming with us." "On what charges?" Iris demanded. "What evidence do you have beyond my uncle's word?" "Murder, for one thing. Theft of property belonging to the estate of Thomas Kellerman. Conspiracy to defraud the territorial government. The man's voice carried the smugness of someone who believed himself untouchable. "We also have witnesses who saw you meeting with known criminals, accepting payment for information about territorial banking operations." "That's a lie, and you know it." "What I know is that you're a fugitive from justice who's been hiding in these mountains with a wanted man. Speaking of which, where is Mr. Calder?" Wes eased closer to the cavern mouth, staying in the shadows while he assessed the situation. Through a gap in the rocks, he could see 6 men in military uniforms, real cavalry, not hired guns, masquerading as lawmen. They had positioned themselves professionally, covering all angles while their leader interrogated Iris. She sat on a stone ledge with her hands bound behind her back, her chin raised in defiance despite her obvious fear. Even as a prisoner, she maintained the dignity that had first captured his heart. But he could see the exhaustion in her posture, the strain of days spent hiding and running finally taking its toll. The leader was a colonel, judging by his insignious man in his 50s with iron-grey hair and the bearing of someone who had spent decades commanding others. His face was weathered but intelligent, suggesting a career soldier rather than a political appointee. "Colonel Morrison," one of the younger soldiers said quietly, "maybe we should just take her back to Denver and let the courts sort this out." "The courts will sort it out, Lieutenant," Morrison replied. "But first we need to deal with her accomplice. A man who kills deputy marshals doesn't get to simply walk away." So they knew about Crawford and his men. Somehow, word had reached the territorial capital faster than Wes had expected. Which meant this wasn't a chance encounter. These soldiers had been sent specifically to capture both him and Iris. "Those weren't deputy marshals," Iris said firmly. "They were hired killers working for my uncle, corrupt men who—" "Enough," Morrison cut her off. "I've heard quite enough of your accusations against Sheriff Monroe. He's a respected lawman with 20 years of service, not some villain from a dime novel. Then why won't he let me tell my side of the story in open court?" "Because dead women don't testify," Morrison said coldly, and the threat in his words made Wes's hand tighten on his knife hilt. The colonel was dirty, then another part of Monroe's network of corruption. Real cavalry uniforms, real government authority, but serving private interests rather than public justice. It was exactly the kind of institutional rot that had driven Wes away from law enforcement in the first place. But knowing the enemy didn't solve the immediate problem. 6 trained soldiers in a defensible position, holding the woman he loved as hostage and bait. Even with surprise on his side, the odds were terrible. Wes had faced worse situations during his ranger days, but never with so much at stake. He studied the cavern's layout, remembering details from the times he had stocked it with supplies. There was a back entrancea narrow passage that connected to a series of natural chambers deeper in the mountain. It would be dangerous to navigate in the dark, and it might not even be accessible anymore, but it offered the only chance of approaching unseen. Moving with infinite care, Wes circled around to the rear of the formation and began working his way through the maze of passages that honeycombed this section of the peak. The going was treacherous loose rock that could shift without warning, tight squeezes that left him barely able to breathe, blind corners where a wrong turn could lead to dead ends or fatal falls. But his father's knife rode steady at his hip, a reminder of the legacy he carried and the obligation to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. 3 generations of Calder men had faced impossible odds and found ways to prevail through courage, cunning, and an absolute refusal to surrender when justice was at stake. The passage opened into a chamber directly behind where the soldiers were holding Iris. Through cracks in the rock wall, he could hear their conversation clearly now, and what he heard made his blood boil. "Arrangements have been made for your transport back to Denver," Morrison was saying. "You'll be held in the territorial prison until your trial, which I'm told will be quite brief." "And if I'm found innocent?" Morrison's laugh was ugly. "Miss Monroe, there are 6 witnesses prepared to testify that they saw you murder Thomas Kellerman with your own hands. There's physical evidence linking you to the scene. Your guilt is a foregone conclusion." "Bought witnesses and planted evidence," Iris said quietly. "My uncle's been thorough. I'll give him that. Your uncle's been patient, Morrison corrected. He could have had you killed immediately after Kellerman's death, but he chose to give you a chance to surrender voluntarily. Instead, you chose to run, to hide, to consort with killers and outlaws. You've made your own bed, Miss Monroe. And what about Wes? What happens to him? Mr. Calder killed 4 federal officers in the performance of their duties, Morrison said. That's a hanging offense, no trial required. When we find him, he'll be shot on sight. The words hit Wes like physical blows, not just because of the death sentence they represented, but because of what they meant for Iris. Without him alive to corroborate her story, she would face Monroe's corrupted justice system alone and defenseless. He had to change the odds somehow, had to find a way to turn this situation from hopeless to merely desperate. 6 against 1 was suicide, but maybe he could make it 6 against 2 if he could free Iris and get a weapon into her hands. The plan that formed in his mind was audacious to the point of madness, but it was the only option he could see. He would have to trust in the knife that had never failed his family, in the skills that had kept him alive through years of frontier violence, and in the love that had given him something worth dying for. Moving carefully through the narrow passage, Wes positioned himself directly behind the spot where Iris sat. The rock wall here was thin, barely 3 inches of stone, separating the chamber from the passage. With enough force applied at exactly the right spot, it might be possible to break through and create an opening large enough to reach her. But timing would be everything. He would have only seconds before the soldiers reacted, only moments to free her bonds and arm them both for the fight that would follow. If he miscalculated by even a heartbeat, they would both die in this cavern. Wes drew his father's knife, feeling its perfect balance in his hand. The Damascus steel caught what little light filtered through the passage, throwing patterns of shadow and gleam across the stone walls. 3 generations of Calder blood had consecrated this blade in defense of innocence and justice. Now, it would either preserve that legacy or die with it. He pressed his ear to the stone, listening to the conversation beyond, while he gathered himself for the effort that would determine both their fates. Morrison was still talking, outlining the charges and evidence that would convict Iris in a rigged trial. The other soldiers were restless, eager to complete their mission and return to the comfort of civilization. None of them were watching the back wall of the cavern. None of them suspected that death stalked them through passages older than human memory, guided by love stronger than fear, and carrying a blade that had tasted the blood of 3 generations of enemies. "Colonel," one of the younger soldiers said nervously, "shouldn't we be worried about this Calder fellow? Crawford's men were found dead, and they say he's some kind of expert with weapons." "Crawford's men were careless," Morrison replied dismissively. "We are not. Calder is 1 man against 6 trained cavalry soldiers. If he's foolish enough to attack us, he'll die quickly." Wes smiled grimly in the darkness. Morrison was right about one thing: this would be over quickly, one way or another. He raised the knife, feeling its weight, its perfect balance, its readiness to bite deep into whatever stood between him and the woman he loved. The blade that had protected his family for 3 generations was about to face its greatest test. With a prayer to whatever gods watched over desperate men and the women they loved, Wes struck the stone wall with all his strength, driving the Damascus steel into the crack where weathering had made the rock weak. Once, twice, 3 times each blow, sending spider webs of fractures racing through the stone. On the 4th strike, the wall gave way in a cascade of rubble and dust, revealing a gap just large enough for a man to squeeze through. Wes lunged forward into the cavern, his knife already moving toward the ropes that bound Iris's hands, while his voice roared a challenge that echoed off the stone walls like the war cry of his Cheyenne ancestors. The real fight was about to begin. The wedding ring had belonged to Wes's mother, a simple band of gold that she had worn through 23 years of marriage, until consumption finally claimed her in the winter of his 15th year. His father had pressed it into his hand on his deathbed 7 years later, along with whispered words about finding someone worthy of the promise it represented. For all these years, it had remained wrapped in soft cloth at the bottom of his possessions, waiting for a woman who could make him believe in forever. Now, As chaos erupted in the cavern and gunshots echoed off stone walls, that ring seemed like a talisman of hope, a promise that somehow, impossibly, they might survive this and build something beautiful together. Wes's knife had cut through Iris's bonds in a single fluid motion, freeing her hands just as the first soldier raised his rifle. She rolled sideways off the stone ledge, taking cover behind a natural rock formation, while Wes spun to face 6 startled cavalrymen who were scrambling to react to his unexpected appearance. "Kill him!" Morrison roared. But his men were positioned for guarding a passive prisoner, not fighting a warrior who had materialized from solid stone. Their careful tactical positioning became a liability as they tried to bring their weapons to bear without shooting each other. Wes moved like water flowing around obstacles, his body remembering skills learned in a dozen frontier battles. The Damascus blade flicked out, opening the throat of the nearest soldier before the man could pull his trigger. A second thrust, precise and economical, found the gap between ribs and pierced a heart that stopped beating before its owner hit the ground. But there were still 4 of them, and they were recovering from their initial shock. Morrison's pistol boomed in the confined space, the bullet chipping stone inches from Wes's head. Another soldier fired, and another, filling the cavern with smoke and thunder, while lead ricocheted off walls with deadly whines. Iris had found the rifle dropped by the first man Wes killed, and she was using it with the skill he had taught her. Her shot took a 3rd soldier in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his own rifle clattering across the stone floor. Not a killing shot, but enough to remove him from the fight. "The woman!" Morrison shouted. "Take the woman alive!" 2 soldiers turned their attention to Iris, advancing with bayonets fixed, while Morrison and the remaining unwounded man continued trying to corner Wes. But the confined space that had initially favored the soldiers was now working against them. Too many bodies, too much smoke, too many weapons trying to find targets in the chaos. Wes saw one of the soldiers raise his rifle toward Iris and threw his father's knife with the same precision he would use to pin a playing card to a tree. The Damascus blade took the man in the center of his chest, punching through military wool and into the heart beyond. He fell backward, the knife still protruding from his sternum like a steel flower. But that left Wes unarmed except for his bow, which was useless in the close quarters of hand-to-hand combat. Morrison saw the opening and pressed forward, his saber drawn and gleaming in the lamplight. The colonel was older but experienced, his blade work efficient and deadly. "Should have stayed hidden in your mountains, Calder." Morrison grunted as he attacked, his saber cutting silver arcs through the smoky air. "Should have let us take the woman and minded your own business." "She's my business," Wes replied, dodging a thrust that would have opened his belly. "Has been since the moment I found her." They fought across the cavern floor, steel ringing against steel, as Morrison's saber met the tomahawk Wes had pulled from his belt. It wasn't an ideal weapon against a trained swordsman, but it was what he had, and he had learned to make do with whatever came to hand. Behind them, Iris was engaged in her own desperate struggle with the soldier whose shoulder she had wounded. He was trying to capture rather than kill her, reaching for her with hands that trembled from blood loss and shock. She twisted away from his grasp, using the empty rifle as a club to keep him at bay. "Enough of this," Morrison snarled, stepping back from their duel and raising a pistol instead. "You're too dangerous to take alive." But before he could fire, Iris's rifle butt caught the wounded soldier in the temple, dropping him like a felled tree. In the same motion, she snatched up his fallen pistol and spun toward Morrison, her green eyes blazing with fury and determination. "Drop your weapon," she commanded, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. "Drop it now." Morrison hesitated, caught between 2 threats, Wes with his tomahawk raised to strike, and Iris with a cocked pistol aimed at his chest. The calculation was simple. He might kill one of them, but the other would certainly kill him. "You're making a mistake, Miss Monroe," he said, though his gun hand was already lowering. "I'm a federal officer acting under direct orders from my uncle," Iris finished coldly. "From a corrupt sheriff who's been taking bribes and murdering innocent people to cover his tracks. I know exactly what you are, Colonel. You can't prove any of that." "Maybe not," Wes said, moving to retrieve his father's knife from the dead soldier's chest. "But we don't need to prove it to everyone. Just to enough people in high places who still care about justice." Morrison's eyes narrowed as he weighed his options. The cavern was filled with smoke and the smell of gunpowder, and 4 of his 6 men were dead or unconscious. Even if he managed to kill both his captors, he would still have to explain the losses to his superiors, justify the failure of what should have been a simple arrest. "What do you want?" he asked finally. "Safe passage out of these mountains," Wes replied, "and a written statement detailing exactly who sent you here and why." "I can't." "You can and you will," Iris interrupted, "or I'll shoot you right now and claim self-defense. Given what you and your men tried to do here, I don't think any honest court would convict me." Morrison stared at her for a long moment, seeing something in her face that convinced him she meant every word. Slowly, carefully, he set his pistol on the ground and raised his hands. "Very well," he said, "but this won't end here. Sheriff Monroe has resources you can't imagine, connections that reach all the way to Washington. He won't stop until he's dead or in prison," Wes said flatly. "Those are the only 2 ways this ends." As they bound Morrison with rope from his own equipment and forced him to write the confession that would expose at least part of Monroe's network, Wes found his thoughts turning to the simple gold ring hidden in his pack. The immediate crisis was over. They had survived against impossible odds and gained valuable evidence of the corruption they faced. But survival wasn't enough anymore. He wanted more than just another day, another week, another year of running and hiding. He wanted a lifetime with the woman who had proven herself his equal in courage and determination, who had stood beside him in the darkest moments and emerged stronger rather than broken. "What are you thinking about?" Iris asked softly as they secured their prisoner and gathered the weapons scattered across the cavern floor. "The future," he replied honestly. "Our future, if you'll have it." She smiled, and despite the smoke and blood and chaos around them, it was like sunrise breaking over mountain peaks. "I thought that was already decided." "Some things shouldn't be assumed," he said, pulling the cloth-wrapped ring from his pack. "Some things should be asked properly." Her eyes widened as she saw what he held, understanding dawning like light in her face. Around them, the evidence of violence reminded them both how close they had come to losing everything, how precious the chance for happiness truly was. "Iris Monroe," Wes said, dropping to one knee among the debris of their victory. "Will you marry me? Will you build a life with me in these mountains, far from the corruption and cruelty of the world below?" "Yes," she whispered, tears streaming down her face as he slipped his mother's ring onto her finger. "Yes, to all of it. Forever and always, yes." When they kissed, it was with the desperate passion of people who had stared death in the face and chosen love instead. The simple gold band caught the lamplight, like a promise made tangible, a future forged from hope and sealed with blood. Morrison watched from his bonds with cynical eyes, but even he seemed moved by the display of emotion. "You think a wedding ring will protect you from what's coming?" he asked. "No," Wes replied, helping Iris to her feet without releasing her hand. "But it gives us something worth protecting, and that makes us more dangerous than you can possibly imagine." Outside the cavern, dawn was breaking over the Colorado peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and promise. They had won this battle, captured evidence that could expose their enemies, and found in each other the strength to face whatever came next. The war wasn't over. Monroe still controlled Denver, still had allies in high places, still possessed the resources to make their lives difficult. But they were no longer alone, no longer running from shadows and living on borrowed time. They were partners now, in the truest sense, bound by love and sealed by adversity into something stronger than either could be alone. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, and that made all the difference. As they prepared to leave the cavern where they had fought for their lives and found their future, Wes touched the ring on Iris's finger and felt the weight of 3 generations of love and commitment. His mother's simple gold band had waited years for the right woman, the right moment, the right promise. Now it had found its home at last, just as he had found his in the heart of the woman who wore it. Some treasures were worth any price, any risk, any sacrifice. Love like theirs was the rarest treasure of all. The cabin deed lay spread across the wooden table like a map to paradise, its official seals and careful script transforming their mountain sanctuary from temporary refuge into permanent home. 6 months had passed since the confrontation in the cavern, 6 months of legal battles and testimony, and the slow grinding of justice through territorial courts. But finally, the document that made their dreams real had arrived. 160 acres, Iris read aloud, tracing the boundary descriptions with her finger, including water rights to Copper Creek and mineral rights to any deposits found therein. She looked up at Wes with eyes that sparkled like the creek itself. "It's really ours." "Free and clear," he confirmed, still amazed that the territorial government had honored their agreement. Colonel Morrison's confession, combined with the documents Thomas Kellerman had hidden and the testimony of witnesses who had finally found courage to speak, had brought down Sheriff William Monroe and his network of corruption like a house of cards in a windstorm. Monroe himself was dead shot while attempting to escape from custody, according to the official report. The reality, as Morrison had privately admitted, was that too many powerful men had been implicated in the corruption scheme to risk a public trial. Monroe's death had been convenient for everyone except Monroe himself. "Justice," Morrison had said with bitter irony, "is sometimes better served by a bullet than a verdict." Iris had inherited not only her cleared name but also Thomas Kellerman's substantial estate, most of which she had used to purchase this land legally from the territorial government. The rest had gone to reward those who had helped expose the truth, including a substantial sum to Jake Morrison for his loyalty and discretion. Now, on their wedding day, they stood together in the cabin Wes had built with his own hands, surrounded by friends who had traveled from across the territory to witness their union. Jake Morrison was there, of course, along with several other mountain men who had known Wes during his years of solitude. Dr. Elizabeth Hayes had come from Denver, Roan, of the few people who had believed Iris's story from the beginning and had testified on her behalf. Even a few reformed members of Morrison's cavalry unit had made the journey, men who had been caught up in corruption but had chosen to serve justice when given the chance. The ceremony itself was simple but profound, conducted by Circuit Judge William Patterson on the cabin's front porch with the Colorado Peaks as their cathedral walls. Iris wore a dress of ivory silk that she had sewn herself during the long winter months, decorated with pressed flowers from her journal, and embroidered with patterns that told the story of their love. Wes wore his best wool suit, cleaned and mended until it looked almost new, with his father's hunting knife at his hip as both weapon and symbol of the legacy he was passing on. "Do you, Wesley James Calder, take this woman to be your wife?" Judge Patterson asked, his voice carrying clearly in the mountain air. "I do," Wes replied, his eyes never leaving Iris's face. "For better or worse, in sickness and health, in freedom and in captivity, until death do us part." "And do you, Iris Elizabeth Monroe, take this man to be your husband?" "I do," she said, her voice strong and clear. "In wilderness and in civilization, in silence and in song, in poverty and in wealth, until death do us part and beyond." They had written their own vows, words that reflected the unique journey that had brought them together and the challenges they had overcome. When Judge Patterson pronounced them husband and wife, the kiss they shared tasted of pine resin and creek water and the wild freedom of the mountains that had claimed them both. The celebration that followed was everything a mountain wedding should be: music from Jake Morrison's harmonica, dancing on the porch under strings of lanterns, stories told around a bonfire that burned bright enough to be seen from the valley below. Dr. Hayes had brought real champagne from Denver, and they toasted the couple with tin cups filled with golden bubbles that sparkled like captured starlight. "To Wes and Iris," Jake called out, raising his cup high, "may your love be as enduring as these mountains and twice as beautiful." "To second chances," Dr. Hayes added. and to the courage it takes to fight for them. To justice, said Lieutenant Morrisonth, Colonel's nephew, who had testified against his own unit to help expose the corruption, and to the people who make it possible. As the evening wore on and their guests gradually departed or settled into bedrolls around the dying fire, Wes and Iris found themselves alone on their porch, watching the stars emerge one by one in the clear mountain sky. The deed to their land lay safely inside, along with the marriage certificate that made their union legal in the eyes of both God and territorial law. Mrs. Calder, Wes said softly, testing the sound of her new name. How does it feel? Like coming home, she replied, leaning against his shoulder. Like everything I went through, all the fear and running and fighting was just the road that led me here. Any regrets? Only one, she said, and his heart skipped a beat until she continued. I regret that it took me so long to find you. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the night sounds of their domainth, whisper of wind through pine boughs, the distant call of an owl, the gentle murmur of Copper Creek running clear and cold through their property. It was peaceful in a way that neither had ever experienced before, the deep peace that came from knowing you were exactly where you belonged. I have something for you, Iris said eventually, reaching into the pocket of her wedding dress. A wedding gift. She handed him a small, leather-bound Volumia new journal, its pages filled with sketches and watercolors that chronicled their entire journey together. Every significant moment was there, his cabin, as she had first seen it, the wanted poster that had changed everything, the hidden caches where they had sheltered, the cavern where they had fought for their lives and found their love. But the most beautiful drawings were the simplest Wanishi's hands as he carved arrows, his face in sleep, the way sunlight caught in his dark hair, the gentle expression he wore when he thought no one was watching. She had captured not just his appearance but his essence, the quiet strength and hidden tenderness that had drawn her to him from the beginning. It's the story of us, she said softly, everything from that first day to this moment. I wanted to preserve it all so that someday when we're old and grey, we can look back and remember exactly how it felt to fall in love in the wilderness. Wes turned the pages slowly, marveling at her skill and the love that showed in every careful line. The final drawing was a portrait of them both as they had stood during the wedding ceremony, their faces radiant with joy and hope and the absolute certainty that they had found their perfect match. It's beautiful, he said, his voice thick with emotion. You're beautiful. Everything about you, everything about this day, it's more than I ever dared to hope for. We're just getting started, she said with a smile that promised decades of happiness ahead. This is only the beginning of our story. Above them, the Colorado sky stretched vast and eternal, filled with stars that had witnessed countless human dramas, but few as perfect as this one. Two souls who had found each other against impossible odds, who had fought for their love and won the right to build a life together in one of the most beautiful places on earth. In the morning, they would begin the practical work of marriage, expanding the cabin, planting a garden, establishing the routines that would carry them through years of seasons. Iris's art was already gaining recognition in Denver and beyond, her paintings of mountain life bringing enough income to supplement what Wes earned from hunting and trapping. They had even discussed taking in travelers occasionally, offering hospitality to those who sought the peace and beauty of the high country. But for tonight, it was enough to sit together on their own porch, on their own land, surrounded by the evidence of a love that had conquered corruption and violence and despair, to claim its rightful place in the world. I haven't hunted anything this beautiful, Wes said quietly, repeating the words that had changed both their lives that first day in the canyon. No more hunting, Iris replied, taking his hand and feeling the solid weight of his wedding ring against her fingers. We've found what we were looking for. Have we? We found each other, she said simply. Everything else is just details. As the night deepened and the fire burned down to glowing coals, they made their way inside to begin their life together as husband and wife. The cabin that had once sheltered a lonely man's isolation now held the laughter and dreams of two people who had discovered that the greatest treasures weren't gold or silver, but the love that could transform a wilderness into a paradise. Outside, the mountains stood eternal and magnificent, guardians of a love story that would echo through the canyons for generations to come. And in the valley below, Copper Creek sang its ancient song of water over stone, carrying their joy downstream to the wider world like a message of hope written in liquid music. Some stories end with tragedy, some with bittersweet longing, but the best ones, the ones that matter, most end with love, triumphant, and promises kept under a canopy of stars. This was one of those stories, and it was just beginning.